Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. I always start these things by trying to keep expectations low. Disregard that very praiseworthy speech. But no, thank you so much, Nikki. And thanks, Maria, and thanks, Jersey and Chloe, and everyone who organized this event. My name is Peter Dixon. I teach negotiation and conflict resolution up at Columbia. And I'm really glad we did that round of introductions because it really hit home just how much wisdom and experience and potential there is in rooms like these. And it is really nice to be able to be back in rooms like these and not looking at our computer screens. A few months ago, about 6 months ago, the United States Institute of Peace sent out this email saying they were going to start this this monthly forum called Pastries with Peace Professors, which sounded both delicious and interesting. Until I realized it was just a Zoom forum to which we were expected to bring our own pastries. So I'm just thrilled we can be back in spaces like these, and I hope we can continue holding these sorts of events. So I'm going to speak about, I'm going to start by speaking about one research project that I carried out with a team in Oakland, California, with the Possibility Lab that Nikki mentioned, which is a part of the public policy school at UC Berkeley. And then try to use that to introduce some other bigger questions and projects that I have going on, including a few right here in New York City. So in conflict resolution, in my classes, which some of my students will be taking next semester, we talk a lot about unmet needs and how unmet needs can contribute to cycles of conflict and really work as drivers of conflict. And we try to target interventions designed to resolve conflict or transform conflict to address those specific unmet needs. And the theory goes, this is how social change happens. This is how conflicts are resolved or potentially even transformed. And one of the questions that I look at is how are needs actually defined, and importantly for designing interventions, how are needs actually measured? What are the measurement frameworks and the measurement technologies that policymakers, programmers, practitioners are using to actually measure the needs to which they are designed, for which they're designing interventions? And I want to take the case of criminal justice policy, specifically public safety policy, to illustrate why this matters and why it's important to look at the measures. So for most public safety policy, the fundamental measures that are used to define the need for safety typically revolve around crime statistics, murder rates, arrest rates, recidivism, etc. And these are really important indicators. There are a lot of problems with how those indicators are actually, the information and data that goes into those indicators. I'm sure folks in this room know about that a lot more than I do. And I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm interested in is the effects of using a suite of measures that are fundamentally based in and around crime statistics to actually craft public safety solutions. What these indicators do, what these measures do that are used to define the need for safety, is they fundamentally limit the kinds of opportunities and the kinds of policies that policymakers look to increase safety, to make communities and people safe. And for the most part, that typically revolves around policing. And furthermore, to measure the effects, the success or the failure of these policies, those same measures are used. So if policing drives crime rates down, it's effective. It's a good policy. It's meeting that need for safety. Now, I don't think that's necessarily 100% wrong. What I'm going to talk about today is how it's very incomplete and what is being left out of the picture of public safety, specifically the kinds of measures we're using to define the need for safety, ends up limiting the kinds of interventions and policies that policymakers look to. So my fundamental point here is that measurement matters, both for how we design solutions and how we benchmark and measure the effects of those solutions and declare them either successful or failures. So this project I carried out starting I think in about 2021. It was with this group, Possibility Lab, which is based out of UC Berkeley, and it represented a partnership between Possibility Lab and another group that I work quite a lot with called Everyday Peace Indicators. Everyday Peace Indicators is essentially a network of researchers based at a few different universities around the world. My colleagues, Amina Firshow, who's based out of Brandeis University, and Roger McGinty, who teaches at Durham in the UK, are two of the scholars associated and connected with this group. And what we try to do with Everyday Peace Indicators is talk to communities who are affected by social problems, to understand how they see and experience those problems in everyday life, and then from that extract actual measures, actual indicators that can be used both to design and target policies, and then measure the effectiveness of those policies. So this was the fundamental question with which we were working in this project. How do those most affected by crime and violence define their need for safety? And importantly, what do these definitions tell us about criminal justice policy? So starting in 2021 and wrapping up, in some ways the project is kind of still ongoing, in certain later phases. We worked with 6 different community-based organizations who you see up on the screen, who represent different communities across the city of Oakland, which is this map you see in front of you. This is essentially a heat map designed to reflect how, much like the city in which we live, Oakland is a very polarized city that's stratified by race and by socioeconomic levels. And for the most part in Oakland, the communities that both experience crime and experience policing live in these communities you see that are colored dark. And the organizations that we worked with work in these different parts of the city representing different communities across those cities, different racial communities, different linguistic communities. And if you want, in the discussion, I can talk a bit more about how we actually reached out to and worked with these organizations, because I think the relationships between researchers and in particular community-based organizations is in and of itself a really important topic to discuss. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that in this presentation, but it's something that I love talking about, so we can return to that subject. So there are not going to be a lot of people in these slides. This is my only slide that actually shows people, even though I'm talking a lot about bottom-up and community-driven measurement. But I just want to emphasize that all of this work is rooted in these sorts of conversations with communities across the city of Oakland. I'm just going to describe for you very briefly the basic process from which this information was developed. It's pretty simple. It involves first, through working with community organizations, bringing groups of 10 to 15 people together in discussion to ask a pretty simple question, which is, what signs show you in this community whether you're safe or not? Let's see, I don't actually have any pictures of those discussions, but you can imagine they're in rooms like these, and they last about 2 hours. And what is meant by the community is something that we talk about as well, and we can go into more of that in the discussion if you're interested. And then we have a second phase, which is where these indicators come from, which is from these 2-hour, very rich discussions about what both the presence and the absence of safety looks like in a particular community. We extract these different kinds of indicators, which you see listed here on this poster up on this picture, which we then use to host a community voting process. Some folks refer to this as democracy using dot stickers, which is essentially asking folks of these lists of different signs that actually show whether the community is safe or not, what do you think are the most important, the most significant? If you were bringing someone from City Hall or the City Council to your neighborhood, what would you want them to pay attention to? And some of these are visible, you can actually see, and some of them are not visible. Some of them speak, actually I would say most of them are not. Most of them are intangible, speak about things like social relations. Here are a few examples. So, what signs show you whether this community is safe or not? Whether neighbors drop off food at your place when you're sick or need some help. Whether you see kids outside playing in the street. Whether the police come quickly when you call them. These are 3 of around 600 of these different little indicators that we extracted from the focus groups that we shared back to various communities through these processes. So just to kind of give you the overall picture that this painted. Again, we worked with 6 different organizations, hosting events like these in 9 different communities across Oakland, holding 24 different focus groups and these bigger public meetings, and collected these 600 or so indicators, everyday indicators of safety. And then what we do is working with our CBO partners, is we sit down and we analyze those indicators and the voting results, and we try to put them in different thematic buckets to kind of paint this holistic, multidimensional picture of safety from the perspective of communities who live with safety problems in their everyday lives. And what we ended up doing in this particular project was coming up with, I think there are 7 thematic buckets, so I'm just going to describe those. So what we call state control, or probably what you would typically think of when you think about safety, involves interactions with police, interactions with different other state agencies, child protective services, etc. Violence and stressors capture another dimension that typically comes to mind when you think about safety. It includes both actual experiences of crime, in addition to some of the just stressors in daily life that include speeding cars, that include noises, etc. The physical environment, seeing trash, broken glass, potholes, whether there are street lights or not, whether those streetlights are working. Youth and young people, opportunities or lack thereof that young people have in the community. Here we're getting closer to things like economic security, food security, housing security, the relationships that those young people have with their elders, whether those young people have mentors or not, whether they have access to safe spaces after school. Social relations, this is a very large category. Relationships between neighbors, whether neighbors know each other's names, whether they feel comfortable dropping food off at each other's place. Racial relations, whether the neighborhood comes together for block parties, for basketball, etc. Economic security, whether there is opportunity, what those opportunities are, unemployment, and health, including both physical and mental health. So, as you can see, from a simple question like, what signs show you whether this community is safe or not, you get an incredibly rich and robust set of responses. And from those who are familiar with a public health approach to public safety, this is not all that surprising. What this helps us do is to really map both the breadth and the depth at different communities, across different communities in one city, what this multidimensional picture really looks like. It also allows us to go deeper into these categories and further map them thematically. So when we say social capital, what are we really talking about? When we talk about young people and youth, what are those different categories and themes that are important? Just gonna pull up one example here, social capital category, just to give you a sense of just how many different topics are included in that thematic. And again, at the bottom of where all of these categories are coming from in this research process are folks in community, in discussion, talking about their everyday experiences. It also helps us map the interactions across these different teams. So what this shows you is simply if we have an indicator that we've put in at the bucket of violence and stressors, but also in the bucket of social capital, how do those different relationships work across these different dimensions? And I'll just give you an example of that relationship because it's one of the strongest. But here are a few of the indicators that we extracted from, that we identified through this process that to us reflected both elements of social capital as well as elements of violence. So for example, bystanders from other ethnic groups step in if they see crime happening on the street. Community members act for themselves, stealing and taking from each other. So you can see actually that these indicators reflect both the presence of safety, which you see in the first, as well as the absence of safety. It's very important to kind of identify both, which I'll get to in a couple of slides and try to explain why. So it's not only a negative problem. There are resources that communities see and hold and draw on to create safety. That's a really important element of this work. Elders can walk around the neighborhood, enter the park, and not be harmed. Feeling like you have to code switch or be on your best behavior in white spaces. Gang members from this community look after each other and other people in the neighborhood. And again, these come from focus group discussions, which are then put up on these posters that you saw in that first picture, that give community members a chance to actually vote on these and say, yeah, for me, that's a really important sign that things are safe or are not safe in that community. So we can kind of get a sense of which of these really resonate at broader levels. Okay, so that's sort of understanding the thematic breadth and depth of what a problem like safety looks like to communities beyond the metric of whether there is crime or not. Another analytical opportunity that this kind of work presents is it allows us to understand safety at an ecosystem level. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So, as I said, in our field, in conflict resolution, we talk a lot about unmet needs and how unmet needs drive and reinforce conflict. We also talk a lot about how conflict systems are very complex. A lot about complexity. And especially about how in conflict systems, there are feedback loops that end up reinforcing cycles of conflict and escalating those cycles of conflict. And what this indicator approach to measuring community safety does is it kind of allows us to apply that complexity framework onto a problem like safety. It's actually looking at public safety as a conflict system. And here's what I mean by that. So I mentioned how many of these indicators reflect a negative problem, the absence of safety. Fewer indicators, but still a significant portion, also reflect where community members see the presence of safety, the resources that they have as community members that they can draw on. And by analyzing those, what we're doing is trying to put those different indicators in conversation with each other to demonstrate how these indicators actually reflect these kinds of feedback loops that we know escalate and reinforce conflict cycles. So what does a negative feedback loop that is making a community more and more, less and less safe actually look like from the experience of a community member? So you can sort of zoom in, and I've essentially mapped some of these 600 indicators into cycles. Now, you may disagree with these cycles. This isn't sort of a black and white science, but what this is trying to do is demonstrate how these indicators don't just function on their own as signs that the community is safe. They all reflect how problems associated with the lack of safety reinforce each other. So I'm just going to read these. If we start up here in the top left corner. So police are more violent and aggressive than black and brown people. You feel scared when you see the police in your community. Trusting the police means signing your own ticket to God, wrongful imprisonment, or unjust treatment. Police are trained to lie, deceive, and confuse us. So these are different elements of the conversations that we had with communities that came up on their own, which we put in conversation with each other to try to demonstrate how the way these communities are experiencing policing and the way that police forces are trained and deployed are contributing to these kinds of negative feedback cycles. At the same time, if we zoom back out, you can go into the upper right-hand corner and look at positive feedback loops. So again, some examples that came from our focus group conversation. Successful people from the neighborhood give back and serve as role models. Young people have mentors to guide. Kids have basic life skills, like knowing how to manage their money. Youth have alternative choices to criminal activities. So again, some of the indicators that came up in conversation with different communities that folks then voted on to highlight which were most important to them, that we think actually show a potential positive feedback loop that can help make communities more safe, according to their own definitions of safety. A lot of these focusing on opportunities for youth, the relationships between youth and elders, mentorship, life skills training, etc. Okay, so which is a question that I always try to step back and ask my students when they bring their work to me. What is sort of the take home here? Why does this matter, other than putting together fancy PowerPoint slides? So I think of this in two different ways. One is kind of the theoretical significance, which is trying to shift paradigms. I wouldn't say I'm successful at shifting paradigms, which I think was part of this introduction. But I think it's an important thing to try to do. And the other is actually informing policy. And this is the social significance of policies. And so I'm just going to share some examples in practice of what that looks like, or at least what I and my colleagues try to do. So in terms of shifting the paradigm, I started with this cycle of how crime statistics both drive public safety policy and then are used to evaluate the effectiveness of those policies. And here, shifting the paradigm looks something like this. It's not doing away with crime statistics or crime indicators, but putting them in conversation with the actual indicators that demonstrate what safety means and how safety is experienced by communities in their everyday lives. Now, to do this, there are all sorts of questions, logistical questions, questions about political opportunity. Does this mean that municipal policymakers should be out in the community running perception surveys once a month, maybe. But in terms of actually shifting the paradigm, in terms of, and understanding and reflecting on what are the measurements that policymakers are relying on, it poses a lot of important questions. Okay, the other element is informing policy, the social or the political significance of this work. I think there are probably 4 different ways that this sort of approach can have policy impact. In the Q&A, I can talk a bit more about what I and my colleagues have actually been trying to do in terms of reaching out to policymakers in Oakland and the kinds of conversations we're having and relationships we're developing. But just at a conceptual level, what are those different ways where an approach like this can shape policy? One is to help identify or at least promote the idea of holistic interventions by showing how safety is really a complex conflict system and that these different indicators reflect positive and negative feedback loops. Actual policy interventions can and I think should be designed in ways to try to interrupt those negative feedback loops and reinforce those positive feedback loops. And that necessarily means designing holistic interventions. It also shows how, where there are more narrow interventions, that you can actually expect to see cross-policy outcomes. So if you think about that relationship between social relations and experiences of violence, thinking about a violence interruption strategy that might be rather narrow, but is designed and targeted in such a way as to target some of those social relations that are also reflected in those indicators. Thinking about this in terms of multi-system solving. So the way that city agencies are designed, they're not always able or really expected to design holistic interventions. But at the same time, when you see safety from the perspective of communities and can understand that one dimension of safety is very closely related to another, you can think about these more narrow interventions in a way that you might expect to see impacts in other areas, other policy areas. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, offering a technology or a process that can bring community voice into conversation with policymakers in a way that meets some of the needs for efficiency that policymakers have when it comes to actually collecting and using data for policy creation. So this is just one project among too many that I always have ongoing. I wanted to just sort of step back and share some of the other questions that I'm interested in. I've been living in New York City for quite some time, but this is only my second year actually teaching at Columbia and working with the Center for Justice there. And so I'm trying to develop more projects like the one I presented in Oakland here in New York City, and take it a step further to ask not just how do communities see and experience safety or the lack thereof, but what are the actual mechanisms that facilitate or hinder closing that gap between community experience and the policy process? What are the opportunities to bring community voice into conversation with policymakers? What are the obstacles? Looking at this both from the community experience, but also from the policymaking experience, and actually trying to understand, at the city council level, policing level, what are the different ways that community voice is or is not reflected in policymaking process. I am also doing some work with the Red Hook Community Justice Center, and hopefully soon with the Brownsville Community Justice Center, to ask some of these same questions, but not about safety, but rather about community justice. What does community justice actually mean? How is it experienced by community members? What does it mean to bring community justice to to impact the communities. One of the projects that my Center for Justice colleagues and I are developing, I'm a bit of a latecomer to this process. They've been doing really, really good work for years now, is actually looking at how community violence interventions reshape social relationships at the community level in ways that can prevent gun violence and gang violence for at-risk youths. I am still doing a bunch of this work in the country of Colombia, where really the bigger question that I'm working on, and again, this is in partnership with other colleagues, is what are the gaps between national peace policy? Colombia is undergoing a historic peace process that started in 2016. And what are the gaps between that national peace process and local community level experiences of and priorities around peace? And then I'm trying to put all this into a book, which is actually going to be, at least in my mind, not yet on paper, looking at 3 different justice institutions where I've actually worked or with whom I have worked to look at some of these same questions, which is how do justice institutions actually bridge that gap between justice policy and community voice. So I have a PhD in sociology, and my kind of first foray into the justice world, I'm not a lawyer, which I always start with that. Was actually working at the International Criminal Court, where I was brought on to help them think about how do we measure our impact in communities in Eastern Congo and Northern Uganda, where we are bringing this international criminal law framework. In Colombia, there's a National Restorative Justice Court called the JEP, or the HEP, which was established as part of the 2016 peace process, which is asking very similar questions. And as I mentioned, I've been working quite a lot with the Red Hook Community Justice Center in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which is a small neighborhood court, which is asking a lot of the same questions. And I think there's some really interesting work there to look into, to understand how institutions of justice relate to and interact with the communities who are experiencing the problems that they're trying to address. Thanks very much.
So I think you agreed beforehand to entertain questions from the audience.
No, I gotta go.
No justice here. So if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand or shout it out. You look like you're about to help. Yes? Oh.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
I don't, believe me, I don't need that.
well, it's just for the. I'll hold it in proximity for the purpose of the recording, if I can figure out.
Your process is fantastic. The method that you presented, given what has happened on Columbia's campus and a couple of our CUNY campuses, can you see a project that would use a similar methodology to address what happened last semester?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. Absolutely, 100%. I think what a process like this does is it necessarily, as I said, draws out the complexity and the nuance and the contradictions of conflict systems that from up here are often seen in very black and white and non-nuanced terms. So if we apply that to college campuses, where issues of safety were very much front and center, I think one of the problems, one of the challenges with an institution like Columbia or any institution of higher learning is how do you, in safe ways, give the community, students, faculty, alumni, a voice for them to actually surface their complex interactions, their complex experiences with something like safety. So one of the major problems with the conflict on college campuses has been the ways that media have drawn out the very extreme polarized positions that different groups have. I think there was an article in the New York Times just yesterday, actually, that in my estimation is kind of doing this. Losing in that process just the diversity of experiences that students are having. Now, the problem, well, I would say that the fundamental challenge there is the political and the media context, which do not do not lend support to frameworks that promote complexity and nuance. At the same time, I think there's a real opportunity. So my undergraduate college, Middlebury College in Vermont, they experienced their own conflict over a right-wing speaker who came to campus. I think it was 2019. And he was shouted down by students and he couldn't speak. And it actually made national headlines. The New York Times came up to Vermont. They wrote about it and sort of wrote about how, they framed it in terms of how political polarization was obstructing the education process, and in response, actually, what the university did, which I think is the absolute right thing to do, is they kind of doubled down on conflict resolution. They said, you know what? The problem here is not that there are political differences. The problem is we don't have the spaces and the capacity to actually bring those different viewpoints together in a productive way. And so they created, it's a small campus, it only has about 2,000 people, but they created a university, a college-wide Center for Conflict Transformation, which since 2019 has actually been doing just that. They've been holding spaces, actually training the community in dialogue processes. And when the current conflict came around and students set up an encampment on the Middlebury campus, what they had was institutional capacity to just simply go out and talk to people, build up relationships, and they knew how to surface some of that complexity, some of that nuance. And I think has been one of the schools that it hasn't been a complete success, but more successfully addressed this particular conflict. One thing that Columbia has started doing, this was not my initiative, our program has some support, is set up what they call listening tables, which are actual tables that you will go and see on the Columbia campus. Sometimes they're set up right next to a big protest that's going on, where it's a more open version of this that I just presented, where students are simply invited to come in a circle and talk and share their experiences. Applying an approach like this to that sort of methodology would mean actually from those conversations, trying to extract and reduce the information and the complexity that comes up to share out more widely, just from listening to students. Here is what this conflict looks like from the perspective of those in our community, not from the perspective of the national or international media. So they haven't done that. It's I think the political climate is in many ways one that certainly does not lend itself to that. It's perhaps just completely prevented. But from the basic perspective of listening to community members in a way that can surface their experiences and their voices, I think that's absolutely what we need.
Thank you. I wonder if Middlebury's experience and expertise in language helped to facilitate that kind of a program. But we've got another question. Hold it. So.
The question is also a statement about work that we did that I think is very complimentary to what I wish that we had to do. Resource that your program facilitated, but ours was from the community perspective. And we, there were 2 times, one of the foundation was hate crime in a particular community, Venus. The other was in the same community, your community mediation center, still exists, community mediation services, and saw ourselves as a facilitator, the parents, families, and support system, but also the community at large. And we held open space processes where we invited the various agencies, nonprofit agencies, from the court, probation, from child welfare, churches, block associations, and really put it out in the community. We had a process where they identified what could be done, and they had a whole array of possibilities. It ended up in coalitions of agencies, churches, block associations, relationships to the police, the local police. We did some mission training for the police, particularly in areas children where there was conflict, particularly with youth, there's youth violence is an issue, and what spun off were groups that were working, and we did the same thing with homelessness prevention and similar groups, agencies, as well as a very powerful group of churches that actually had every service sign up for mediating family issues because so often families spin off. And I wondered if you have had any experiences or what has come out of your work, the kinds of mobilizing of the community as opposed to policy makers.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm familiar with your work to some degree, so thanks for sharing that. We have interventions in conflict resolution that are kind of a similar version of this approach, where different members of a community are brought together to discuss a central problem, but in a way that doesn't simply surface the debates and arguments, differences of experiences, but actually surfaces something akin to these kinds of indicators that actually give the community members something tangible and very focused to help them kind of take that next step and move forward towards, okay, well, what does the solution actually look like? And that's at the community level, at least, I think, been our experience thus far. So I can speak to the Oakland experience. When we were trying to create partnerships, I spoke about the issue of relationships between researchers and community-based organizations. To us, we spent a lot of time actually shopping this project around to different CEOs in Oakland. And we heard a lot more no than we did yes, which to me was actually a really important part of the process. And I was really glad that we had built into the project, all these projects have financing and you have to have time to put into them. We're all in kind of different lanes. But one thing this enabled us to do was actually spend the time to develop relationships that continue to be productive and mutually beneficial to this day. And that was really kind of one of our main criteria and one of the main criteria for the organizations that we ended up working with. So that's just a long way of saying that the 6 CDOs that you saw on the screen are all still involved, not with me out here in New York, but more with the folks at UC Berkeley, in ways that they're actually making use of this information. And from that side, it's manifested in a few different ways. So some CBOs have used this as kind of a needs assessment and used it to go out and actually apply for grants and win grants. So it's been a very useful tool for that. Other organizations have used it to drive forward very specific community actions. So one of our CBOs, for example, is in this really interesting neighborhood in Oakland that's centered around a park. And the neighborhood itself is it's maybe 1/3 Asian American, 1/3 African American. There are Latino communities, there are white communities, there are other communities as well. But it's a very multiracial neighborhood, and a lot of the interracial tensions come from that. And they've actually used this as a platform to try to bring representatives of those different groups together to try to focus, for example, on like park cleanup days, or advocating to city council to not build a mega project next to the park, but actually invest in streetlights and park cleanup, things like that. So it's provided a kind of a useful like anchor point in some ways to bring communities that are part of the same neighborhood, but actually have a lot of conflict with each other, together in some ways to move forward. So that kind of facilitating collective action has been useful as well. And this is not on the community side, but I'll use this as an opportunity to present this as well. But in terms of the kind of policymaker reaction to this work, so Oakland has a Department of Violence Prevention, which, as in many cities, they're all organized in different ways. In Oakland's case, the DVP is very, very small, has an annual budget that is minuscule compared to the police department. And actually, during the whole, so like many cities, Oakland had a reimagining public safety process in the wake of the 2020 racial justice protests. And instead of actually reducing the police budget, that process ended up with an increase in the police budget. And the DPP was sort of left trying to figure out how to articulate their value to the public safety landscape, which is very hard to do when safety is only defined as crime moving up or down. And so for them, a framework like this that actually puts those 7 different thematic buckets from young people to mental health in a safety framing is actually a really useful way for them to go to city council or to city hall and say, this is why you should fund us, and actually demonstrate that we're having an impact on safety. Here are the indicators we're going to measure. We're not trying to move crime rates. We're trying to facilitate social trust, right? And here are the different ways that we can measure. So that's been, and I think that would probably be a common experience with those sorts of departments in other municipal settings as well. And they actually have now a project where they've actually gotten some funding and are going to be developing projects using some of this information to guide and evaluate those projects.
Yeah. So, Professor, this screams to me the impact of overrepresentation of white men as policymakers. Can you apply maybe a gender lens to your research and how feminist theory is looking at what you're revealing to me? I mean, when you talk about public safety as opposed to crime statistics, of course we need more lighting because we don't want to walk down the street in the dark for our safety. Kamala Harris is saying we need to have Medicare go into the homes because she was personally a caretaker. So I can comment on the gender aspect. Appreciate it.
No, thank you. Yes. I didn't have a chance to sort of go into detail on all those different thematic buckets, but what surfaces as a cross-cutting theme across all of them are issues of gender, race, and class. And the gaps between a crime-based focus on safety and a holistic so I'm not calling this a public health-based approach to safety. It has a lot of similarities to public health, but where I think it kind of goes beyond the public health approach to safety is precisely what you're saying, is actually bringing into conversation with safety very critical questions of gender inequality and systemic racism. And those are not throughout the indicator, but those are baked into many of the different indicators. Because they're indicators, though, one of our experiences has been they're in some ways more palatable to policy audiences who are always in search of indicators, because that's the kind of technocratic language that they speak that sort of drives funding and allows them to demonstrate impact. So, I don't want to call this like a Trojan horse, but in some ways it's a way to bring those more critical issues of race and gender into a policy context in a way that doesn't necessarily scare people. That said, so one of the, and I think this is a very legitimate critique of this process. One of the concerns that we heard when talking to different potential partners across Oakland, the first was, so we had Berkeley. Berkeley is not in Oakland, but it's next door. Some of our team members are from Oakland, but Oakland has been working on these issues for many, many years, a lot longer than we have. And so there were legitimate questions of identity and representation. But the other main question we heard was, if you're just going to talk to people about what safety means to them, then you're just all of the biases that those folks have are simply then going to be baked into those indicators. And there are biases in these indicators that are gender-based or racial biases. And a lot of the work that organizations who said no to us are doing, I think how they would call it, is focus more on kind of a consciousness raising, rather than simply taking all of the sort of biases and contradictions and power dynamics that exist within communities and surfacing those. So while on one level these indicators do help reveal and reflect issues of gender, race, and class, there are also a lot of gender, race, and class-based biases baked into them, right? And that's just a kind of a contradiction that reflects contradictions in everyday life that we as researchers deal with. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The discussion really brought to my mind a question: can this process address needs where extreme power imbalances most often result in policy that doesn't meet those needs? And I'm thinking the campus protests, the need is to stop genocidal policy, and we're nowhere near shifting that paradigm. Or the protracted land conflicts in Colombia, where people are still, despite all the peace processes, still being pushed off their land and killed for trying to defend their land rights.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those examples. To me, if I were to take the example of college campuses and the kind of need that this could meet, I would not put what you said on the table as sort of the need that this process could address. To me, the need that I think this could address is a need for the college community, take Columbia for example, to actually participate more actively in conversations about what's going on in that community. Right? So it's a very sort of community-centered, very, very community-centered process. And some of those voices, I think, would put on the table precisely that. Some places certainly would not, right? And to me, the need is actually creating a space where that contradiction can exist and that tension can exist in a way that doesn't break down social relations or escalate conflict. Taking the example of Colombia and land conflict, on the other hand, yes, absolutely. I think this is not a silver bullet, but what this process can do is it can, for many communities, the peace process for them has been an abject failure, precisely because it has not addressed historic inequalities based on land ownership, or land titles, or the numerous ways that land is played into conflict. And what we see in those indicators actually are a lot of issues related to land. And so what it does is it gives them, and potentially Colombia policymakers, a way to evaluate the effectiveness of the peace process according to the differences it's actually making in terms of people's land. But that's because, we're talking to folks who in their own community are experiencing those land-based conflicts in their everyday life. The big question is sort of that theory of change assumption that I'm making, which is if you turn that into an indicator, why would someone in Bogota or in the department capital of Colombia want to pay attention to it? And that's a question that I don't necessarily have an answer to right now, but it's one I'm very interested in, is what actually drives decision makers to pay more or less attention to a measurement like that versus, and won't get too far into Colombia, the traditional measures that they are interested in.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe.
Okay, so thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, Peter. I would like to ask you, in your peace project about Colombia and Colombia, South America, does Venezuela come on board? If so, in which way?
Yeah. So yeah, not so much in the community. Well, so the communities where we've been working are nowhere near the border of Venezuela. But I think certainly the issue of Venezuelan migration into Colombia is impacting the country as a whole. We don't see a whole lot of that in the indicators that we've been hearing there. And I think that is for that reason. It's simply that issue on a day-to-day level, in terms of daily experience, hasn't necessarily impacted the communities that we're talking to. I think if we were to do this process, certainly in urban centers where many of those immigrants are arriving, or in communities closer to the border, we would see a lot more. And that is both a weakness and a strength of this approach, is it's so hyper-local. It is very much rooted in the day-to-day experience of folks in their local geographies, right? People are interacting with on a day-to-day basis. And if a particular issue or problem has not reached those communities or is affecting their sort of day-to-day life, that's not going to surface in this process, right? So that's why I always think of this not as like a replacement for crime statistics, for example, but as an addition to, so that the more top-down, more universal kinds of measurements and indicators can be in conversation with that experience. Yeah, sure.
I was wondering, so you've spoken a little bit about how there's this juxtaposition between public health and public safety. And in my experience, it's kind of been where like public safety is like one thing and public health is a separate issue. I'm wondering, and kind of like maybe spoken to a little bit, do you see us getting to a place where there's more cohesion, where it's public health and public safety, not public health versus public safety?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I didn't actually get a chance to talk about this, but one of the projects that I'm working on based on this project is looking at the different, if you go back and trace the history of public safety policy in the United States, or zoom in on policing, if you look at the history of policing and different frameworks that have been used to understand the role of police in society, you can trace different eras of policing in the United States. And the interesting thing is each one of those eras kind of comes with its own different ways of measuring both safety and the impact of policing. And there are different measurement technologies that are created in those different eras. I won't go into it now, but it's a really interesting history. When we get to the current era, to today, there is a lot of conversation around public health approach to crime, right? And so you have programs like Cure Violence, which are trying to take a public health approach to crime and look at crime as the downstream consequence of social problems that are really very much related to public health. The challenge, though, is there's not a kind of coherent measurement technology that police departments or public safety policymakers can use to actually create and realize that public health approach. And I think the missing element is simply actually talking to communities about their experience with crime. So I think there's a long way to go, but I'll end with kind of a hopeful example. I spoke about the work that my colleagues at the Center for Justice have been doing. They did this in the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy, and I think we will have the opportunity to do it soon in the neighborhood of Brownsville in Brooklyn. It's a project called Project Restore, and it is targeted towards youth who are at risk of gang and gun violence. I won't go into how they're identified, but contrary to a typical policing-based approach to gang violence, which is going and arrest everyone, this project is taking more of a community-based approach that is addressing the needs as they're defined and experienced by these youth, and trying to meet them, and through different ways, through restorative justice circles, through employment opportunities, through actual one-on-one counseling. There are a few different elements of this project. It's very holistic, and it's designed as though it were sort of mapped onto a process like this, but it's really small scale. However, the Brooklyn DA's office, a very progressive DA, but still one of the DAs of one of the biggest jurisdictions in the United States, was really interested in this process and actually joined on as a supporter. And to me, that's a really encouraging sign of a shift, at least at a local municipal. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're after the 10 o'clock hour, so let's all thank Peter Dixon. Thank you for being on the ACR-GNY again. You have a little time. I think Peter Dixon can stick around for like 15 minutes or so. You can come and ask questions. Also, there's a Polaroid camera on the bagel table. Feel free to take a little selfie to have a little moment of this convening the session. And thank you for all of your great questions. And please feel free to interact and connect in the last few moments. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.